What's up guys, this is Pinkacross. A good or bad lead matchup can be a significant factor in how a game goes, so knowing how to choose well is very important. I'm going to be explaining how to pick a lead using examples from Gen 9 OU, but these principles apply to nearly all competitive singles formats. I'm first going to review what makes a good lead Pokemon, then go over how to predict your opponent's lead, and finally explain the process I use to choose my lead. Let's get right into it. The first step in picking a good lead is making sure your team has good lead Pokemon. A good leading Pokemon has one or more of the following four things. Number one, long-term beneficial utility moves, or abilities. Things like Knock Off, status moves like Toxic, Will-O-Wisp, or Thunder Wave, entry hazards like Stealth Rock, Spikes, Toxic Spikes, or Sticky Web, Weather, and Terrain. These are really good things to get off at the start of the game because they help beyond just that first turn, meaning it's good to have a Pokemon knocked off, good to have Stealth Rock up, or good to have Rain up, generally as early as possible. Number two, powerful breakers that can exert immediate pressure. Pokemon that can crack skulls right off the bat and get a kill or a lot of damage off on lead are generally a good thing to have. Number three, fast pivot Pokemon that can safely exit a bad lead matchup with U-turn. Even though a bad lead matchup isn't ideal, being able to get damage and switch into a more favorable matchup while eliminating the chance of your opponent doubling is definitely a good thing to have as a lead Pokemon. And number four, slower, bulkier pivots that can gain switch initiative by using their slow pivoting move. Ideally, these Pokemon have Regenerator, so if the opposing lead Pokemon decides to attack, they won't be hurting too much for it for the rest of the game. Some great leads combine many of these things, so it's good to keep in mind that a Pokemon may fall into two or more of these categories. There are also some Pokemon that are great overall but make for really terrible leads, and I want to go over a few of these just to show what happens when a Pokemon does not have any of these things. Zamazenta does not have any long-term beneficial moves, and furthermore it has an ability that only activates once, making it a terrible lead. Iron Valiant and any other Pokemon using booster energy is generally not a good lead since you'll be wasting that booster energy in a similar way to how Zamazenta wastes its ability Dauntless Shield, but also setup Pokemon are not good leads either. This is why Dragonite and Kingambit are not very good leads, on top of the fact that they don't get knockoff, any great status moves, or any way to really set anything up that's going to help the game long term. Now these are all very good Pokemon, but they're better for the middle or end game. So generally, you do not want to lead with these guys, and there are plenty of other examples of terrible leads out there. Ideally, your team has at least 2 or 3 of the different types of leads, and at least 2 or 3 lead Pokemon overall. Though the more you have, the better. There's nothing wrong with a team where 5 Pokemon are solid lead options. If your team lacks decent lead Pokemon, it will be harder for you to pick a good lead and easier for your opponent to counter lead you. Now let's go over how to predict your opponent's lead. Your opponent is probably going to lead with number one, the best Pokemon that matches up against your team. So it's really easy to look at your opponent's team and say, okay, well, I have a thing that does well against 4 of their Pokemon, and that's the most Pokemon covered by anything on my team, so I'm going to lead with that. And it really could be anything. But generally, if you look at something that has a good matchup against most of your team, there's a solid chance your opponent will lead with it. Number two, just obvious leads. There's a lot of times where a lead is very easy, and if the video hasn't already made this clear, picking a good lead is difficult. So your opponent might just go with the most brain-dead option, whether it actually does well into your team or not. Good examples of this are Gliscor and Glimmora. Gliscor can lead with Protect and establish its Toxic Orb, making it a very strong lead, and Glimmora can lead, usually holding a Focus Sash so it can live any attack, go for Stealth Rock, and get some attacks off, and potentially get up its Toxic Spikes as well thanks to its ability. So even if these aren't good against your team, say you have a really great setup sweeper that could take advantage of Gliscor using Protect, or you have a great counter lead to Glimmora, your opponent might go for it anyway, so you definitely want to be aware of these obvious lead options. Number 3, the Pokemon that threatens you most offensively. Your opponent may want to just try to get a kill as early as possible, so even if you do have a few things that would make this lead a disaster for them, your opponent may well just go for whatever has the highest chance of getting a kill against you. Number 4, your opponent may lead with the Pokemon that counters whatever they predict you will lead with. For example, if you're using a hyper offense team with a Glimmora, your opponent will probably expect you to lead Glimmora and lead with whatever is going to counter that. Now, this is pretty broad. Which one will it be? Is your opponent going to lead with something to try to get a kill? Are they going to predict you and lead with that? Are they going to go whatever with the most obvious lead is? There are a lot of options. And that's the thing, you don't know. Your opponent could go with a lot of different routes. And overall, trying to predict the singular Pokemon your opponent will choose is not a consistent method. The reason I walked you guys through this list is not so you can narrow down your opponent's lead to a single option, but rather so you can identify 2 to 4 probable leads. With this information, it becomes a lot easier to pick your own lead. Before I go over the process for picking a lead, please remember to subscribe, like, and leave a comment if you're enjoying the video. It helps out a lot. So then how do you pick a lead? Number 1, identify 2 to 4 probable leads your opponent may select, using the steps we discussed when trying to identify what your opponent will lead. In this case, I have an example set up where you're using a grassy terrain team, so we are the user on the left using grassy terrain, and we're facing a common Choice Specs Kyurem sample team on the right. For the sake of this example, assume the Rillaboom is Choice Banded, the Heatran is Air Balloon Stealth Rock, and the rest of the teams have fairly standard sets. So here, I've identified 4 probable leads. So the opponent could lead with Landorus, because it's an easy lead and Stealth Rock is fairly strong against my team with everything taking the 12.5%. Potentially Kyurem as well, with everything very weak and taking super effective damage from common Kyurem stabs. Note that your opponent won't be certain your Heatran is Air Balloon, although they may suspect. Cinderace, because it has a good matchup into Rillaboom, Ogerpon, Wellspring, and Serperior. And Galarian Slowking, since Future Sight does not have any immunities on my team and it matches up well into Serperior and decently into Heatran. So these are some of the things I think my opponent might lead with. And this is kind of an unfortunately difficult lead for me because my opponent has basically nearly their whole team, with the only things that aren't probable being Iron Valiant and Kingambit. So now let's move on to step 2. Check for disaster leads. Are there any leads that would be absolutely tragic if your opponent were to lead with it and you were to get it wrong? Well, in this case, not really. We happen to know this Kyurem is Choice Specs because it's a sample team, so we're not too worried about the possibility of a Boots Kyurem, say, leading on Rillaboom, going for an Ice move, and then Earth Powering or Ice Beaming through the entire team. Now, if it comes to that, we could check the damage calc just to make sure, but since we have Air Balloon Heatran, there's nothing on our opponent's team that would lead to a catastrophe right off the bat. Number 3, we're going to check for free leads. Do we have anything that covers all 6 Pokemon? Is there any really easy option that there's just nothing our opponent can do anything about? Well, unfortunately in this case, no. The closest thing would probably be Heatran, but our opponent still has ways around that. And if they predict we're going to lead with Heatran, they have some easy options they could go for. Perhaps Cinderace U-turn lead into Landorus and then go for a Scorching Sands. Could be a Galarian Slowking lead if they've altered the set and have Surf. They could even lead with something we didn't initially expect, like Iron Valiant, and threaten to one-shot with close combat if they predict we're going to lead with Heatran. So unfortunately, we have some solid leads, but we don't have any lead that's absolutely free. Number 4, we're going to check which of our Pokemon cover the common leads. So looking at our opponent's team, I identified 2 Pokemon that strongly cover a lot of these leads, Rillaboom and Heatran. Rillaboom can Wood Hammer and deal a ton of damage to Landorus, which will be very good for both Ogerpon, Wellspring, and Hawlucha. and it matches up well into Galarian Slowking since it can one-shot with a knockoff. That being said, it doesn't match up so well against Kyurem and Cinderace. Heatran matches up decently well against all of these Pokemon, although it would not be ideal if we just get our Air Balloon popped by a U-turn, since that would really open the team up to Kyurem. Number 5, we're going to identify, of these Pokemon, what happens to each in a bad lead matchup. So what happens if we lead with Rillaboom and then we get faced with the Cinderace or the Kyurem? Well, if we get faced with the Kyurem, we're not in the worst spot in the world. We can switch into Heatran pretty easily. In fact, our opponent may even predict that we'll go into Heatran and go for an Earth Power, which would be great for us. Cinderace would be more difficult. A U-turn would be tough for us to switch into. We'd have to take massive damage, either give up Hawlucha's Grassy Seed or Raging Bolt's booster energy, or give up Heatran's Air Balloon. So that would be a really bad situation if we lead Rillaboom into Cinderace and get U-turned on. That would give us a terrible, terrible start to the game. Now, in the case of Heatran, probably the worst case scenario would be a Cinderace U-turn lead as well. Something to note, this is going to make it a really appealing option to our opponent that we've identified that as a double worst case scenario. But this is overall less bad than the previous case we outlined. Heatran, unlike Rillaboom here, would at least get up Stealth Rock in this worst case scenario. Number 6, select the option that covers the most options while minimizing negative outcomes. In this case, our opponent has a definitely better lead situation than us in general, with not much we can do about the Cinderace lead. But the way we can minimize damage here is going to be leading with Heatran and getting up Stealth Rock. At least we can do that, and we can engage in a bit of a prediction game when the Kyurem comes in. There are, of course, exceptions to these sets of rules and steps. You may have a Pokemon that has none of the specifications of what makes a good lead, but it just happens to match up extremely well into your opponent. You may also have a situation in which you've played your opponent so many times that your leading habits have gotten predictable and you need to shake it up. Maybe if I face that same team again on ladder, I'll lead with Rillaboom instead of Heatran. You may also have a matchup so bad that you need to make a hard call out on the lead, otherwise you have little chance of winning. Generally though, these steps work well and will lead to a good situation for you. Now let's take a look at 2 real examples. In this situation, I identified likely leads as Glimmora, since it's a very easy and obvious lead, Primarina, since it counters Hisuian Samurott, probably the most obvious lead on my end, and I also noted Roaring Moon as a possibility since it counters Galarian Slowking, a very common lead for me, and generally matches up well against my team. There are no disaster leads here that I'm scared of. Even Roaring Moon and Gouging Fire are manageable in the case of a bad lead matchup. I ultimately decide to lead with Samurott because it matches up well against Glimmora and Roaring Moon. As you see here, my opponent ends up deciding to lead with Primarina, but this is okay. I considered this. I have a very solid switch into Primarina in Glowking, so I was able to go for the chilly reception here, and I end up getting my Rillaboom in, which puts me in a pretty good situation. So in this case, identified the likely leads, and I had a lot of options. I went with Hisuian Samurott to cover the Glimmora and Roaring Moon possibility. If I was wanting to cover, say, the Primarina and Glimmora possibility, it would have been better to lead with Galarian Slowking, and that would have left the Roaring Moon open. But let's look at what would happen if I get them wrong. That's the key thing here, minimizing risk. A lot of top play is about minimizing risk and minimizing the chance for things to go really poorly for you. So in this case, I had Slowking that if faced with a Primarina lead, I could very easily switch into and put myself in a better position. If I ended up getting it wrong and a Roaring Moon starts Dragon Dancing for free against me, that's a much tougher situation for me to deal with, and I don't have a really solid immediate answer. Let's take a look at another example. Here I identified likely leads as Garchomp and Alolan Ninetales, with a small chance of a Kyurem or Gholdengo lead. In this case, I decide to go with Cinderace since it can Will-O-Wisp Garchomp and Pyro Ball and Alolan Ninetales. The other thing to look at here is that Cinderace doesn't really have any bad matchups on this entire team. The worst case scenario would be a Blaziken or a Booster Speed Tusk lead, and that's not even a particularly bad situation for me. This is pretty much a free Cinderace lead. Now my opponent ends up surprising me and leading with Blaziken, probably predicting my Cinderace lead, but this puts me in a totally fine situation since I'm able to just U-turn and bring in my Landorus. Hope you guys enjoyed the video, and I'll see you next time.